Okay, welcome to the next lecture, which is about space. So we talked about line and color before, and now we're talking about space. We'll look at some of the concepts and terms behind it: shape in space, three-dimensional space, two-dimensional space, and linear perspective, which is something artists use to make the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. Works in progress, Rubens, the Kermes, some other means of representing space and distortions of space and foreshortening, because artists like to play, and modern experiments in new dimensions. So shape and mass, there's a couple of ways of thinking about shape and mass. So we're looking at Donald Salton's Lemons from May 16th, 1984. So one way you can look at shape is in two-dimensional media, an area, the boundaries of which are measured in terms of height and width. More broadly, the form of any object or figure. So even if Donald Salton hadn't provided a convenient name that says lemons, you could tell even from the outline um, the shape of lemons. So we got that going. And then Martin Puryear's Self, which is as it kind of implies, a self-portrait. So mass is any solid that occupies three-dimensional volume. So this particular piece is an actual three-dimensional sculpture. And with this one, Puryear is talking about how the self can be something that is a little bit difficult to define. So by making this shape, it can get closer to the way that he considers himself, his kind of internal and secret thoughts. So a couple of ways that you can play with shape is you can think of shape as being the figure, which is the thing that actually makes the shape, and then the ground, which is the surface that it's made on. But in the case of a Rubin vase, you have a figure, which is this vase, and then a ground, which is the white. But then the white also makes two figures. You can see these faces. If you kind of look away, you can see the vase again, and then look back at it again, and you see it. So we call this figure ground reversal. So you can kind of get the reversal of figure and ground. So the original figure is the vase, and then the ground is the white. But then when you look at the white, especially if you make it like this, you can see two faces. So this was a common form of making vases. This Rubin vase is a portrait of Queen Elizabeth and her husband. We can see Queen Elizabeth on the right, and then we can see her husband here on the left, who isn't the king, by the way. So three-dimensional space is exactly what it seems to be. This picture is of Musée d'Orsay. It was designed by Gay Aluenti, and it's in Paris. And this particular museum was designed in such a way that was a little bit different than museums before. The museums previously were generally these neoclassical buildings. So if you're not familiar with the style, go to Washington, D.C. sometimes. That's all neoclassical buildings. And those are fine. The Detroit Institute of Art and University of Toledo art museums are also that way. But in this one, he wanted to make it a space that kind of fit the art. So the original space was altered by these massive galleries, and the artworks echo forms of the architecture. So they make the actual building not just a building, but part of the art itself. It's Barbara Hepworth's two figures, and she's kind of playing with negative space and positive space. So negative shapes or negative spaces are painted white. So she actually, a negative space is something that it's almost like it'll envelop something and you can put something in it. So it's a negative space. You can almost imagine something going in it. So Hepworth um, kind of emphasizes these cavities with the white paint so that you can see the negative space almost as being a figure in a way. And then sometimes the negative space can have a meaning. And that's the case with this feast-making spoon from Liberia, and it's made by the Dan people. And the way these things would be used is amongst the Dan, they have this kind of like traditional get together every year. And a woman from each village or community or neighborhood would be chosen to represent the community at a parade. And she would often be like dressed kind of like as a man sometimes, so showing her power. And she would carry one of these spoons, which are, you can't really see the height of it here because it's not standing next to a person, but it's like almost 2 feet long. So it's pretty big. It's not a spoon you would actually use. But the negative space represents what the most hospitable women can provide. She can organize events and feed tons of people. So the food for the feast is represented by the negative space, and the big part of the feast would be rice. So two-dimensional space, we're looking at Richard Derbycorn, Woman in a Chaise. And you can see crayon and gouache. That just means basically a type of coloring, although in this case it's black and white. So reserve is the untouched white ground. So the pieces that you see here is just the paper with no coloring on it whatsoever. But since we see white as highlights, although the reserve is the bottom layer as far as the surface, as far as the medium that was used, crayon and gouache, it defines the highlights that are closest to the viewer. So this is Caspar David Friedrich's Woman in a Morning Light. And I'm using this one to explain the concept of the picture plane. So the picture plane is, as opposed to the space depicted in the painting, it's an imaginary or theoretical spatial plane corresponding to the actual surface of the painting. So a lot of times artists want to create depth. We have this figure in the foreground, and then we can see all this stuff in the background. So the picture plane would be when it's almost as if you could walk into the painting, and the point when you go from our world to the world of the painting is the picture plane. So if you were to do that with this painting, you would bump right into the woman in the front. But maybe if you did it over the side, then you could keep walking. So oftentimes artists will give this sense, play with scale by putting something that's smaller, this feminine figure, close to the picture plane, and then have it kind of emphasizes the mountains being far off in the background. So linear perspective is one of the ways that artists use, especially in the Western world, so European tradition, the way that they get an effect or an illusion of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface. So the most simple way to do perspective, and it's something you all learn in a drawing class, is 1-point linear perspective. So how you do that is you pick a vanishing point, and then whenever you make things in your picture, you have all the lines lead towards that vanishing point. So you can see that in both of these pictures, all of the lines lead towards that point. So they start parallel and then they get closer and closer together. And so the vanishing point. So when you're making a picture like this, you want to pick a vantage point. In other words, think of like if this was a building, then you think, well, I could be over to the right or I could be over to the left. Once you pick the vantage point and the vanishing point, then it's a matter of just connecting the lines. So recession means if you put the vanishing point pretty much in the center, we call that frontal recession. So all the lines recede towards the front. And then if you pick a vanishing point that's off to the side, we call that diagonal recession. And you can get different effects, not just 3-dimensional illusions, but also effects as far as what you want the viewer to focus on, depending on which of these recessions you use. So early artists in the European tradition, they sort of understood the concept behind linear perspective, but they didn't really get the math. So it doesn't look quite as realistic as later ones. So this is from somewhere in the 13th to early 14th century, and it's from Giotto. As you can see, it's St. Francis renouncing his earthly possessions. We don't have to worry about the content of this particular painting or the subject. Giotto painted this before mathematical linear perspective. was used. So the perspective doesn't quite work. You can even see it before I put the lines on. But once I put the lines on, you can see that they're kind of leading in different directions. Like he gets the idea that you're supposed to have parallel lines that are kind of tilted, but it's not quite right. So it doesn't give you a really good three-dimensional effect. Whereas when you look at this painting from Leonardo da Vinci, his Last Supper, you can really see a good three-dimensional effect. So what you can do with this one is kind of find the lines, and from that, you can see where all the lines are pointing to, and you can figure out where the vanishing point is. So if you do that, pause the video and then do that, and then figure out where all the lines are pointing to. Okay, now that you're back, can you figure it out? All the lines point towards Jesus in the center. So that gives you a focus on what you're supposed to be looking at. And all the other figures are gathered around on each side. So, well, probably the first person to use this mathematical perspective that makes really good three-dimensional spaces in painting was Masaccio, and he did that in the 15th century, in the early 15th century, with his the Holy Trinity with the Virgin, Saint John, and two donors. So the Holy Trinity refers to what Catholics believe. So they're a type of Christian where you have a God where it's one God and three persons. So the three persons would be God the Father, who's pictured here, Jesus, who is God's son, or sometimes called the God made flesh. In other words, God made into a human. And then it's kind of hard to see here, but it's a dove, and that represents the Holy Spirit, which means God's presence in the earth. So people say if they notice something, they'll say, that's the Holy Spirit that inspired that. So what Masaccio was using was Brunelleschi's perspective. And Brunelleschi was an architect, and I'll put a video that'll show exactly how Brunelleschi developed this in the description. Brunelleschi was an architect who developed the system for depicting three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional medium. His system is so accurate that a three-dimensional space can be plotted from a two-dimensional painting. So you have this two-dimensional painting, and from that, you can figure out exactly where the figures are. So it's kind of amazing. This is like a mathematical model, and that's part of the reason why it looks so realistic. So he's using it kind of like the way that Leonardo is, and he's focusing us on one thing. But what he's focusing on is perhaps a little bit more complicated. So what Christians believe is that Adam and Eve, who were the first people, they believe that they committed the original sin. And if you're not aware of what that original sin is, they ate from the tree, the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that was the one thing in the book of Genesis in the Bible that God told them not to do, but they did it. So as a result, he kicked Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. And that was really terrible for them because before that, they were innocent. They basically couldn't sin, couldn't do bad things. They also would never die and they didn't have any pain. And in the Garden of Eden, they had everything they needed. But once they committed the first sin, God kicked them out of the Garden of Eden. And he told men that they would have to work in the fields for their food. He told women that they would have pain in childbirth. And most importantly, he told both men and women that they would die someday. So Christians believe that this original sin not only created those three things, but left a stain on humanity that prevented them from reaching heaven. So Christians believe that after they die, they will go to heaven and they will be one with God. So the first sin and the idea that humans are going to die is pictured here. The skeleton represents Adam. Then Christians believe God, and he's represented sort of as God the Father here, made himself into a man, that's Jesus, and then sacrificed the flesh of that man through the crucifixion. And through that sacrifice was able to wipe away the original sin and allow everybody that believes in Jesus to go to heaven. So the crucifixion was the most important thing that happened for Christians that believe this. So what Masaccio is doing is he's taking a point between these two figures and kind of explaining this short story of the most important parts of Christianity and what they believe. So another thing that artists can do, and especially as time went along, they wanted to do more complex perspectives. In this one, which is Gustave Cabot, Place de l'Europe, l'Europe, sometimes my French pronunciation is not so great, on a rainy day, and he's using 2-point linear perspective. You might not notice it right away, but there's a vanishing point over here and one over here. And you can kind of find the two vanishing points by noticing that the lines over here lead to one point, and then the lines over here lead to a different point. And that makes for a really complex image where it feels like you can really walk into it. So this is how it would be pictured. We have one vanishing point here, another one here, and then you have lines, depending on which side of the picture they're on, leading towards the two disappearing points. Some pictures are even more complicated, but you can still get an effect of three-dimensionality. This is Peter Bruegel the Elder and his wedding dance, which is actually at the Detroit Institute of Arts, which you can find. As a side note, when the city of Detroit went bankrupt, there was a danger, luckily that didn't happen, for a moment that they thought that they would have to sell some of the paintings at the DIA. So the Christie's that does valuations for paintings and sells paintings did a valuation of all the what they thought were expensive paintings at the DIA. This particular painting was valued as the most expensive in the painting in the DIA, and it was valued in 2011 at $250 million. Luckily, it was never sold and it's still there. You're probably like, why is this painting of a bunch of people dancing, getting wasted and making out and doing Lord knows what else worth so much? Part of the reason why is Peter Bruegel the Elder, very few of his paintings survive. So this one, the composition seems kind of random at first. We just have a bunch of people gathered around, but there is a bit of organization that kind of guides your eye. If you look, there is a vanishing point way off in the background. If you kind of look at the figures, now that you put the lines over it, you can kind of see how there's lines being made subtly by the figures. You can also see the other way that artists create three-dimensionality. As it recedes in the space, things get smaller and smaller, and they seem to be closer together. So sometimes people can put the vanishing point even off of the screen. So if you look at this and use the same sort of techniques, if you think about the same techniques as the wedding dance, you can see that the figures, a lot of the lines are leading way off of the screen. And this is actually a similar theme. A lot of wealthy people like to look at poor people or just regular working folks like what you probably are and I am, and shame them for being the way they are, which, you know, normally you don't have any control over. So in the previous one, they kind of just show, look at all these working people. They're just like, they just like to get wasted. They're not even thinking about life. I look at it and I say, wow, these people like to have fun. But the wealthy look at it and they say their life is out of balance. So Peter Paul Rubens, who was wealthy and made paintings for the wealthy, he puts his vanishing point off of the frame. So it gives this idea that this type of behavior, people having fun and drinking and being merry during the kermis, is something that puts them off balance. So we can see that right there. So some other means of representing space, some of them are used in the European tradition, and then some are other ways that people represent space throughout the world. So, you know, single point perspective and 2-point perspective isn't the only way. Um, so there's several different ways of portraying space if you want to be able to visualize something and not show it realistically. So I'll include the definitions for these three in the description for this video. That way you can look at it. But basically, if this building were to be shown realistically, we'd barely be able to see the side panels because they'd look flat as a pancake. So what Theo van Doesburg did is he made these panels, the vertical panels going towards us, the viewer, longer so that we could see what the colors were and we could get a better impression of what it would look like if we were standing on the ground. So basically, the way these different projections work, so if you have an isometric projection, you take one of the three dimensions and you change the scale. So that's what this is, an isometric one. Then if you had diametric one, you take two dimensions and change the scale. And the trimetric would be all the dimensions are in a different scale. So this is often used for architectural drawing because, again, it can help you to see things from all angles better than you could if you portrayed things realistically. So in this painting, the Kumano mandala from the Kamakura period in medieval Japan, it shows a different way of creating space. And if you've ever played video games from Japan, especially role-playing video games from Japan, you may have seen this type of projection used. And it's very intuitive. You probably don't even think about it being used and you understand how it works. So oblique projection is which is what is used. A system for projecting space commonly found in Japanese art in which the front of the object you're building is parallel to the picture plane and the sides receding at an angle remain parallel to each other rather than converging as in linear perspective. So you can see that all the lines of the front of all of these buildings are straight, so parallel to the picture plane. Picture plane remembers that imaginary kind of barrier between the world and the world of the picture. And then we have diagonal lines going off to one side. And so the way you read this is the things that are at the bottom are the things that are closest to us, and the things that are at the top are the things that are farthest away. And again, this works. This is very intuitive, practically as intuitive as the mathematical perspective that's used in the West. Again, you can see it in many video games. So sometimes you see distortions of space and foreshortening. And part of the reason why is because if you portray things realistically, sometimes they might look a little ridiculous. So I'm showing you this one thing that was pretty popular in the 19th century. It's called a stereograph. But if you're old enough or you have a parent or grandparent that has one, there's a plastic device called a Viewmaster that uses this effect. So what a stereograph is they would take these two pictures and they're at a slightly different angle. And when you hold them at a certain distance, your eye mixes them together and gives you this three-dimensional effect. And that's exactly if you want to look up Viewmaster, maybe I'll put a link to it in the description. You can see how this works. So what they like to do with these stereographs sometimes is, enhance the 3D effect. So with this guy, when we have a picture of taken from his shoes, it'll look like it's even more three-dimensional than it would otherwise because his shoes are so huge and his head is so small. So that's what it'll look like if you showed a figure laying down from their feet. Their feet are going to be super huge and take up all the frame. So artists, and it's shown, Albrecht Dürer is kind of showing how this is done. Sometimes they would use math to be able to create three-dimensional spaces. But when you have something complex, like a human figure that's all round shapes like this one, it's really difficult to use math to get them in a spot. So sometimes you use tricks, and this is one trick you can do. You basically take the bumpy thing or round thing with irregular shapes that you want to put into your picture, put a grid in front of it, and then place it in your picture using a grid. So you basically just draw within each square. And that way artists can get a really good effect. a really realistic three-dimensional effect with things that aren't regular, like buildings and floors and such. So if you try to make a picture like this, you would get something like Philip Pearlstein's model in a Dogon chair. So Philip Pearlstein was part of a movement in the 60s and 70s is sometimes called hyperrealism. So he almost wanted to make his pictures look like more than real, like realer than a photograph. So he would use techniques like we saw in the previous slide. But sometimes artists, if they portray things realistically, it'll take away from the subject and it'll take away from the content. So the content's the meaning that they want you to get. So this one, Mantegna's The Dead Christ, if it were to show Jesus portrayed accurately as far as perspective goes, his feet would be taking up the whole frame, just like we had seen in the stereograph previously. And that would just look kind of silly. Since this is a very serious subject, it's Jesus after he'd been taken down from the cross, and you can see the wounds in his hands and feet. And you can see Mary, his mother, and then John, the one male disciple that stayed around, crying for his death. So what the artists do whenever they use 3D perspective, they want to do what we showed before, where the things that are farther away are smaller and the things that are closer are bigger. But in this case, Mantegna reverses it. And part of it is so that it doesn't look like a silly picture. But the other part is so that it emphasizes Christ's body and his head. So foreshortening is to foreshorten by proportionally contracting in the direction of depth. So an illusion or projection or extension in space is obtained. And we saw that in other pictures. I pointed that out in the wedding dance. But in this one, Mantegna doesn't do it because he wants to show the body of Christ, which is the sacrifice that Christians believe is very important, and the head of Christ, which kind of represents Christ as a godlike figure. So by making those larger, even though it wouldn't be realistically this way if you're looking at it, it emphasizes the subject, what Christians believe about Christ, about his sacrifice, and about him being a God. So the modern experiments in new dimensions, these are ones that maybe I'm going to do these for our discussions. So you can I'll just like show you these images and then we'll discuss it in one of our sessions. So in this one, try to figure out, this is 3D, right? But is it? It doesn't look 3D sometimes. So try to think about what Matisse does in this picture to make things look kind of flat. And you can do the same in this picture. And you can try to think about how Cezanne flattened the space.